takes a year to actually get a new product out to market. You don't have the urgency for real-time data. You're trying to go to somebody at Walmart and say, yeah, here's how your product category is doing. And they're looking at you like 6 months is like last decade for me. I need to know what happened last week.
Welcome to LaunchPod, the show from LogRocket, where we sit down with top product and digital leaders. Today, we're talking with Prabhath Nanisetty, Global Head of Industry for Retail Data, Technology, and Quick Commerce at Snowflake. It was a blast getting Prabhath's take on why it's not the model, it's the inputs you use to get the model that's important. How you look beyond just ROI, the packaging lesson every product manager should know, and why honing his product skills at Procter and Gamble, where product management was invented, set him up for his whole career. So here's our episode with Prabhath Nanisetty. Prabhath, how's it going, man? Thanks for coming to the show.
Absolutely. Pleasure to be here.
This is going to be a fun one. I say that every time, but I have yet to have a non-fun episode of this, for me at least. I hope it's fun for everyone else.
I hope I can keep the streak going.
Yeah, right. But I kind of want to start way back at the beginning, because I feel like we always run into this where it's the joke about everyone has a weird way to come into product. But you have a master's in chemical engineering from Carnegie Mellon. That's quite the journey from there to digital product. How were you inspired to take on what is objectively a very hard major? And then what caused you to pivot there?
Yeah, well, let's say it wasn't always by choice. I think when I was graduated with my undergrad, it was 2000, right after September 11th. So there weren't really jobs for a lot of engineers at that time. So I ended up going back for a fifth year master's. And the thing about chemical engineering is a lot of other engineering professions really are actively building things, right? I'm always jealous with the mechanical engineers building robots and other stuff. And then
Aren't we all?
engineers working on breadboards and circuits. And then chemical engineers, it's like, well, I need $1 billion to go build a distillation column. That's not going to happen. So I can do things on a lab scale. So it tends to be a lot more simulation, a lot more math heavy, which, as I've found through my career, really works well in the marketing and kind of digital media profession.
That's fair. I actually saw you have, and we'll get into this in a sec, but you have a big kind of consumer behavior analytics deepness to your career, and that makes a lot of sense.
I'm a bit of a data geek, so I've got an interesting fact for you.
Yeah.
So the census, the US Census does a study. I forget if maybe it's every 3 years or every 4 years, they send out a survey to college graduates. And they ask you questions about your career, how much you make, all of this stuff. And if you look into the data, it's got some great data about degrees and then how much that degree matches your job in different years. And I looked at all of the engineering professions, and the engineering profession that has the lowest percentage of people that still work with anything related to the degree is chemical engineering. So I've almost proven my theory that really it's an applied mathematics degree rather than something leads you into something relevant to chemistry.
I mean, I've always told people that at heart, college is either kind of vocational training or it is learning how to learn, and you can go on to do something else. So, but you graduated and got your master's and then went on to Procter and Gamble. And you actually, for a little bit, applied the role. You were a senior scientist, working on, I think, was it the Bounty product line, or tell us a little bit about how you walked into that.
So I actually internshiped at Procter and Gamble in their manufacturing plant. So it was a plant in Mahoopany, Pennsylvania. So northeast corner of Pennsylvania. And it was eye-opening experience, honestly, because these machines that they're working on are just massive. And any little change results in a massive change downstream that, you could be wasting literally tons of paper and other things. So it was a great learning experience in applying what I knew and the math I knew to downstream the impact of it. When I started full time at P&G, it was in a role where I was given a task basically end to end. It was a form of product management. It was, hey, we've got some ideas that consumers have thought about or we've thought about. Can we take these ideas, actually go demonstrate them on the lab scale, right? Like literally printing paper, individual paper towel rolls, could be colors, it could be patterns, it could be additives that we add to the paper. Let's try a bunch of things and then let's test them with actual consumers and see where there's actually a physical, real performance difference. And where there is, let's go try to scale that up and see if this is a viable product. So that was the task. And I led the product management or the process management side of it.
I feel like very few people who are in the digital kind of, software realm have this big background in CPG, but you're already talking about minimum viable products and like testing quickly and all sorts of stuff. So it's really cool to hear that, some of the stuff
What's another interesting fact? I'm just full of like random trivia. Do you know where product management was actually invented?
Was it Procter and Gamble?
It was Procter and Gamble in 1930.
So there's no better place to learn it potentially than the OG of PM.
Apparently that is true. So it was invented by I forget the role, but his name is Neil McElroy. And basically they wanted to build a new product. And so he basically scoped it out and said, here's the resources I need. Here's what we think this product will do. Here's the business case for it. And so it's credited as the original place where the philosophy of product management was created.
That's kind of awesome. But speaking of which, you moved on from MVP development and kind of understanding this and building this out and building physical kind of lab scale stuff. And you moved on to a much more kind of like consumer insights role. I get a little bit of the background, right? When we talked about, the math involved in chemical engineering stuff, but how'd you make that role jump career wise?
Yeah, it's a weird jump, right? So in the process of creating some of these products, right, you'd have to create it in a lab. Then you'd have to take it to one of their factories or their plants and actually go and try to build it and make sure it runs and then actually runs well enough to actually go create millions of these products that appear on shelves. Well, you're working with a multifunctional team to do that. There's people responsible for marketing. There's people responsible for the financials around it. There's packaging, all of this stuff. And one of the things that was really fascinating to me is the actual consumer testing side of it. So we would take these products, make sure that they're safe and, minimal viable for what we were trying to build. And then we would actually ship them out to consumers around the country and say, hey, we would love for you to give us feedback. And they would use it for a little while and give us, information, whether it's a survey or other things around it. And understanding that was really just fascinating to me because I love how we could turn that into real data that we could then use to analyze it. What was even more fascinating was, there were a few folks in this group that would then take that data and then they could forecast how good this product would perform based on a bunch of historical data. And I just love, if there's one thing I love about math, it's the ability to go predict things in the future based on things that you know today. And they had just a fascinating set of models to go and predict consumer purchase behavior that led to how good we think this product is, that then our finance person could say, yep, this is a viable product and profitable one for us.
And I think I read somewhere in your background that one of the kind of big early accomplishments you had in your role here as like director of consumer insights was an extremely high total forecast accuracy, which I think maybe at a software level where to produce marginal goods is basically zero cost, less important. But what's the import at the CPG kind of side of it? Why is that so vital that you're hitting that target?
The reason why it's important is that, a lot of these products that you're developing just require obviously a ton of investment in R&D. But the bigger issue is that to create, a new roll of paper towels, it seems like a commodity kind of thing, but the amount of equipment that's needed and the amount of energy and products that are used to go create that it's huge. It's very high. And so these machines have to be running like very efficiently and they have to be running all the time to make all this stuff pay out. The problem is when you create these new products, you're inherently like throwing a wrench in the system, right? You're doing things that haven't been done before. You're taking a risk on a bunch of product that maybe nobody wants to buy. And it's, you've just spent millions producing it. And so it's very important for us to know well ahead of time, how well is this going to sell? And then, if it sells poorly, then we'll ton of waste. How are we going to pay off this product? And then if it sells really well and over delivers, then all of a sudden now you've got to figure out how I'm going to, what other machines am I have to change to do this? And there's just lots of issues in between. So, it was really important in an industry like paper to get that right. more so than maybe something that's maybe less mass produced or less commoditized from a material standpoint. The insight there and how to get more accurate is like all good data modelers or forecasters, you realize it's not necessarily the model itself, it's the inputs that you use to get the
Yeah.
model. And luckily, we had an amazing team and have great mentors and other things, other folks involved in this. But really, one of the big insights here is really making sure that we involve a lot of these multifunctional individuals in providing those inputs. And typically, the relationships were, yeah, send me this Excel file. I'm just going to plug it into the model. And part of what I'd love to do is actually, I just love to understand how other people work. How are you getting this data? How are you, having the conversation to even get this data in the first place? And so I spent a lot of time with our marketing folks on, how are you supporting this product? What kind of advertising are you going to do? Why did you choose TV and not radio? And digital was like just in its infancy back
That
then.
was the early days.
Early days, right? They had phenomenal ROI. Anything you did digitally was like 300 ROI, but you were only spending like less than $500,000 in it, which is a big difference now. I'd love to understand those. And that just made me a better forecaster. And I could, really sniff out the BS essentially. And when it wasn't thought out. And then the most important thing is our sales and distribution side, right? So in a fast moving category like paper, if you know that a certain retailer is going to take this product or not going to take this product, or they choose a small size when you thought they were going to take a big size, those are all big differences in how you forecast. And so though really diving into some of the whys was really part of the reason for the success. And it carries through the rest of probably my career where, I encourage a lot of PMs, right? Really take the time to understand this network of influence of your product. A key thing to think about, and take the time to do that early in your career or leading that product, because it's like that Chris Pratt meme, like the longer it takes, the more it's more awkward to start asking those questions when you're much later.
I feel like there's so many things that success goes back to understand deeply the core, most important pieces, and not just at a surface level, but dig in and understand. And like you said, be able to sniff out the BS. We, a few months back, had a guy named Justin Anovic on the show who he made the opposite journey I'm going to mention here, but he started as a sales executive and actually moved into running product. But it's really funny kind of talking about this focus of yours, get into the details, sniff out the BS and understand what's real. You could have made a great chief revenue officer, go into sales forecasts and figure out where it's not really going to happen or not. That said, maybe you get more math to use going into product and consumer insights, but it's just so many fundamental things back into, if you don't understand the fine-grained details of the most important bits, you just can't do it.
It's interesting, this person that you mentioned coming from sales, I think it's actually a phenomenal profession for product. And the longer I've been in my career, the more respect I have for sales leadership and the challenges of selling. And I used to think, way back in my career, I'm like, who are these salespeople that show up at my meeting? They're basically like, no, I can't sell this, or no, we're having difficulty with this retailer. And I used to be like, what are these guys doing? I feel like they're just, they're being nonchalant. I really just got a ton of respect in the role after the one we just discussed, where I actually lived in Bentonville, or actually Fayetteville, Arkansas, for 3 years and worked very closely with the sales organization at P&G. And I realized, boy, these guys, this group of people, they are very data oriented, process it and consume it in a very different way. But, they have to manage people relationships. They've got to manage orders and all this other stuff. And it's, I'm actually in my current role, I'm working with a sales organization, and it's fascinating to see where it all comes together. And you have to be able to blend all of your disciplines, like whether you're deep in tech, deep in math, great with people, all that stuff. It's a great melting pot of all of that to say, all right, how do we actually drive action? And it's really cool. And it's a great skill for product managers to have. And one of the things that I think the best product managers have technology and they have to be able to represent that product and speak to it better than anybody else because, they set the tone for it.
Yeah, it's fine. I shared the same kind of belief early on. But having worked with several really high performing sales orgs, you realize that there's almost no function that wouldn't benefit from having better sales skills, like the truly high performing sales skills. Just, it takes such an incredible kind of intellect and horsepower to do that. But that kind of shared across anything done really well, I've found is interesting and probably more to it than you ever thought.
Yeah.
I do want to, so one question I had for you is, I saw a different bit where it talked about, on top of really accurate forecasting, your group at this point also showed, I think, the highest marketing ROI of product lines at the time. And I've always just been curious, like, we always hear, especially for public companies, on forecast, hitting forecast, based on, hitting expectations. What's more important? Is it hitting that forecast accuracy, or is it being more efficient and growing more?
Yeah.
Or is it a little bit of both?
Yeah. I love that because that's the heart of it. And before I answer that, I think one of the diatribes that I usually have is, I love the marketing profession, right? I've spent a long time in it. But I think there's this tendency to use poorly descriptive language in the marketing profession, right? It's just rife with acronyms and all of these. And I'm still convinced that a lot of marketers have not taken the time to actually dig and ask the questions of like, all right, why does this work? Why doesn't this work? And so you get questions like this one that are simple on the face of it, but it's a great test to understand, like, wait, do you actually understand this concept of ROI and, how it can be good and how it can be bad? But so I think with anything like with measuring ROI, by the way, I used to teach this, right?
Yeah. Nice. We got the right guy to ask them.
Yeah. I'm like super passionate about it because I used to do, with forecasting, I used to do market mix modeling, kind of the early days of that. But you're right. It's not an either or. So with ROI, you've got a couple things, right? It's basically how much did you gain in terms of revenue sales for how much did you spend? But that's simple on the face of it. But if the goal is, hey, I just want to have a high ROI, well, great. You can spend $10,000 and you've got a great ROI. You're not moving any product. But if you keep investing, your ROI goes down because, maybe every new dollar you spend is going to give you just less, but is it still growing your business? Yeah, great. Like, go keep driving that. Where it gets really interesting is what P&G at least called profit ROI, but there's different words for it, like marginal ROI and all that. But really, you want to drive certain vehicles until, they stop being a net positive for you, right? The ROI that you're getting outweigh the costs that you're spending in there. And so there's a point where you can keep going and it's still a great decision to go past this point where your ROI goes down, but you're still driving cases of product or, installs and what. Now, the other consideration is, what are you trying to do as a business? Are you trying to acquire customers because you're still new, or are you well known and you're really trying to keep mind share? And I think these are all considerations. And so if you are trying to acquire customers, let me tell you, trying to acquire customers for, say, a mobile app or something can be not great returns for a while because you're trying to break through this cloud of, attention in many cases. And so in some cases, you're going for a different purpose. Maybe we're just going for driving awareness, or we're driving some sort of positive influence on the product. And so it's really important as a marketer working with a marketing organization to show them kind of the portfolio of business strategy and actions and really start thinking about it so that they can first be educated on that. And then when they get asked by their CFO, wait, hold on, why is this ROI going down? You can articulate it as, hey, this is still good revenue, but let's not get caught up by a grade that somebody's arbitrarily written.
Right. A 30% ROI might be better than 50% if it allows you to keep growing and your goal is we need to grow as fast as we can. And maybe you would have spent less to get 50% ROI, but
yeah,
if you grow a little bit less, then that's probably not as good.
The simpler way to say it is, Heisman Trophy winners were like so great. Why aren't they more successful? Well, it's got to do more than just like the badge that you get or the award that you get, right? So there's more to it.
But I do want to be clear here. Like, you had an incredibly successful run, it seems like, in P&G, and you were there for what, a decade? But it wasn't all roses either. The thing I always tell my team when things get hard is the book about Airbnb is up and to the right,
Yeah.
but along the way in reality, there's a bunch of dips and turns and hard times. And I'm sure periods where they were almost insolvent even and they came back, because it's how you bounce back from the hard things that kind of define a company or a career or anything like that. And so on your end, I mean, it sounds like there's a few things that you pushed through to make successful, but one specific story I found out about was this kind of push to roll out, like early on, some deeper BI dashboards and better understanding of numbers and give people the insights maybe you had, and how that kind of adoption maybe didn't start out as great. But I'll let you tell a story because I'm going to butcher it.
This was actually a little later into my career. I was on our Walmart team. So in most consumer goods companies, one of the things that people don't always know, I mean, it's obvious, but it's just deceptively obvious, that the P&Gs of the world, while they're very consumer oriented, for the most part, they don't actually sell to consumers. They sell to retailers. So the Walmarts and the Targets are their customers. And so it's important for these companies to actually have teams that are co-located with some of our large retailers. So that's why there's a large contingent employees for actually most CPGs sitting in Bentonville or Northwest Arkansas. So while I was there, one of the challenges that we saw is that retail typically operates on an hourly, daily basis. But the challenge is that most of the data that you're buying and that your company buys is actually bought through maybe a headquarters organization. And the timelines for a brand manager or brand leader, these are years, like 18 months. When it takes a year or two to actually get a new product out to market, you don't have the urgency for like real-time data that maybe somebody on your sales team has. So the pain points on that role is using data that was like, call it a year or 2 quarters behind, and you're trying to go to somebody at Walmart and say, yeah, here's how your product category is doing. And they're looking at you like 6 months is like, like last decade for me. I need to know what happened last week. And so from getting a few of these scars after a number of conversations, we ended up creating a different service essentially and buying other data sets to be able to fill the gaps. A large part of this wouldn't have happened without, again, reaching out and understanding, what does this IT guy do? In like Northwest Arkansas, he's a P&G employee. Like, what exactly does he do? And then going to another function called category management. These are the people that, analyze all of the products that are on shelf, and they're the ones designing where the product should go on the shelf, right? Do I put all of the Bounty brand together, or do I take all of the premium Bounty and the premium other competitors and put those together? And then, do it that way. Like, how do you decide all those? That's the role. It's called category management. And really understanding what they do and coming up with some ideas on, what are the biggest pain points that we are experiencing as a team? Is it the speed of data? Is it the source of the data? Is it just a question that we always get asked and we have no idea how to do it? And came from a realization that each of our kind of functions never actually talked to each other, or we would talk, but we weren't actually sharing like actual data or the actual things together. So we got together and started to brainstorm, right? If we had to answer this question from somebody at Walmart, how would we do it? Like, if there were no barriers, like, here's what I would put together. And then it became well, why couldn't we do that? Like, how do we get from here to there? And so it was awesome. It was product management without the kind of the structure, I would guess. And we essentially created a whole set of BI dashboards. That's what was hot at the time, all the Tableau and BI dashboards. But we organized it around kind of topic areas that, we knew that in the course of a year, in this quarter, this is typically what you would do. In this quarter, this is typically what, happened. There's annual planning and other quarterly activities. And so we organized it around those. And for each of those, we had dashboards set up to answer questions during that time. And so we created a whole set of dashboards. It was a huge success, both internally at P&G and, as you can imagine, with Walmart, because they could now actually just go in and ask a question where like pull it up on a screen and here's your answer, Mr. Buyer. So it ended up doing really well. But I think the struggles worked through that process of really making sure that we could even get data or get budgets to go buy our own data. In some cases, it was the same data that we were already buying, just we were buying the same data, but maybe it was just a faster version of it. So there was a lot of under the radar things that we did and getting feedback that were challenging, but we had some good experiences there, but learned a lot from how to work better and more collaboratively across like things to do it.
And I think one of the things I've seen when I've worked on, ops teams and built dashboards like that maybe is building for not the user, but, either the power user who isn't necessarily going to be the one consuming every day, or like the executive stakeholder who's paying, signing the check and wants this drop down, that drop down, this, little feature and this and that. And in reality, the actual user wants like one chart or two charts, and all the extra complexity makes it maybe even less usable. Did you guys run into anything like that?
We did, and luckily by that time it wasn't my first rodeo with BI, and so I think the danger with building to a single stakeholder or the budget holder is that you have to make sure that you're planning for not only what they want, but also what they need to actually like solve the problem that they're trying to get to. Right? Sometimes you see it all the time, right? Thinking back, it would actually be a great way to understand a stakeholder. It's like, hey, send me your proudest Excel document that you've done. And if there are fonts and all this other stuff, you're like, okay, you're an over designer. Like it would be a great test to understand stakeholders. Sorry, I digress. I think there's a tendency for the person that's your stakeholder trying to drive the action to over design certain things. And so you can take two approaches. One that I've done is make sure that you expand that stakeholder network, right? So it's not just the budget holder, maybe it's the user that could be different than the budget holder. And then who's the outcome stakeholder, right? Who's actually receiving the end result of whatever you're delivering. So that's one way to do it. And it's a very effective way because it also helps you discover features that you maybe wouldn't have thought to build, but you can discover them just by understanding how people are using it. And the big part there is, I know most people kind of subscribe to it, is it's actually try to do as much passively rather than actively asking, like show me what that PowerPoint deck that you created was, or show me like the actual, after you filtered a dashboard or something, show me what did you tell that, that stakeholder? How did you receive it? What did that stakeholder do with it after that? Then piecing together that whole chain. So I think that's one way to really assess it. I think the other way is a bit more of an iterative process, right? You try to get people to use it quickly in an MVP state. That's probably the MVP design. But it takes courage to push that through, right? It's not an easy conversation on budget holder because there's always a tendency to perfect and to, in some cases over design. And so those are sort of the considerations. But yeah, specifically with this Walmart one, we knew what we, I think, collectively understood, and we would push out early iterations with buyers where, we weren't anywhere close to our vision, but we would push it to the buyers. And then we would actually discuss like, okay, how did that go? Was there something that, on what we've planned would actually have helped? And it helped us not only design to a better product, but it also helped us prioritize. Like, hey, we thought this thing was, much later stage, but like 3 buyers have already asked about this. Maybe we do need to pull this one forward and prioritize. And you're not going to get that kind of learning without actually doing it. Like everything else is sort of what people say. And, the iterative process helps you get to what people really need.
Exactly. So after this, at this point, you've been at P&G for like 10 years and you've gotten your master's degree in chemical engineering from Carnegie Mellon. You've now gotten your honorary master's in, it seems like product management and consumer insights from your time at P&G. And then you moved on to InfoScout, which is now called Numerator. I wasn't familiar with the company until I, started researching for this. So maybe do you want to just give a quick, the 10-second TLDR on what InfoSight and Numerator does?
Yeah. So InfoScout was one of the original apps that did the receipt scanning on using a mobile app. So I think it was founded in 2011. And very quickly, there was an app that you could, sign up for an account. And whenever you went shopping, you would take a picture of that paper receipt in your hand. And then we could digitize it and turn that into data about who's buying what. And at the time, the reason why we did that is that there were a lot of other sort of consumer panels and purchase panels that were out there, but they required a lot of complex, like an actual barcode scanner where you went shopping, you came out, and then you'd have to lay everything out on the table and scan everything. And I knew from a lot of my consumer behavior that it's important, this is like the survey science and qualitative science that people tell you is the way you collect the data is just as important as the data itself. And so if you're collecting the data and there's lots of friction, you're probably not getting the best data in there. And so we created an app that did that. Later, we also created the ability to connect it to like your email inbox to get all your receipts automatically, and then even connect it to different kind of retailer accounts directly so you could just get the data. So, the types of data was there. But we were the first company that could actually paint a picture of consumers in the US across almost every thing that they bought. So it's not just your typical grocery items and retail, but where did you go, like get that cup of coffee? And did you visit a nice restaurant? And did you go to a hair salon? And piece together this map of purchase behavior, which ended up becoming very valuable for a lot of companies to understand who their competition was. What's my competition when I put it all together and can actually tell? For a retailer, they can figure out like, where else are people going? Like, I sell this product. Why didn't you come and, you come here every week. Why didn't you buy it at my store? Why did you go to another store to buy that product? And you can start to ask those questions. So yeah, it was a great product and it expanded very quickly. And now I think we've changed the industry a bit because at that time for that kind of data, it was a lot of phone calls, right? And Excel sheets. You had to call a consultant and ask them, hey, give me an analysis on why people switch away from my brand. And they work on it for a week or two and then come back to you. And none of that was ever put into a SaaS product before. Like you couldn't self-serve on that data and ask questions of it and tease it. So we were one of the first companies to build not only a different data collection mechanism and data, but also moved the industry to a SaaS-based way to go and like query data, build audiences and all of that.
And it seems like the value here is fairly unquestionable. The early problem you guys ran into wasn't almost one of product market fit. It was packaging, right? There was a bit of friction around people loved the product, but couldn't get their head around how much you all were charging for it. I guess, where did that misalignment come from? Like, is this just a matter of, let's push the envelope here a little bit. We have something brand new on the market and we can get our value for it. Or was there something more than that?
Yeah, this was in just the first maybe 18 months of us even being a company. I think we realized this was a completely new proposition, right? Like to get this level of understand, how people are buying stuff on Amazon or even other places that you couldn't get data from anywhere. And so at that time, this was actually before we even had a SaaS product. We were primarily just delivering like projects just with data and a bunch of consultants. And, I think we got a little ahead of ourselves in terms of, oh my gosh, this is so valuable. We're like, shoot this price sky high and start. And I think there's always this feeling of, it's better to start high because it's easier to like reduce your price later versus start low and then try to increase your price. And there might be some truth to that, but I think we took that a bit too far in the early days. And, I think, while the data was valuable and we had a lot of inbound demand for it, I think we also didn't do a great job of saying, yeah, when you're buying this analysis, that should come with, this kind of analysis, this follow-up analysis when you have questions about the data, maybe some, consulting hours to do some custom type of things, not typical SaaS product thinking, but we had to build a SaaS platform, and this was our way of getting the data for it. One of the big things that we erred on is that when you share such valuable data and like data that's just going to like change somebody's mind, you want to be involved in like the solutioning, or like you want to solve their problem, like blowing their mind. It's so good. You also want to make sure that they've got some flexibility, so you're not immediately going to like nickel and diming, like, oh, that's a follow-up question. That's another, X. I think we did a bit of that because I think we were like, oh yeah, this is so valuable. And I think what I've learned over the years, when you create something like that, is the people that you are selling to and that have taken a risk to even talk to you, right? Like it's like, who's this startup? They've got new data and have taken this risk in there. I think I've realized a lot that we needed to really think differently about some of the early adopters and allow for a lot more flexibility, right? Because in that case, you're still trying to drive a business. You're still trying to, show value to your early investors. But at the same time, your earliest customers are some of your like biggest risk takers. And so, we had to make that right. So we did the things to, make sure we did well by that customer and, other customers like it, because there's other ways for them to give you value. It's not always revenue. It's, could they jump on a webinar and advocate for you and advocate for this thing that you're trying to do? And so I think it took us the early 6 to 12 months to really figure out that, look, this isn't just a data business and we're not just selling a software. We're like trying to change an entire industry on how they think and how they even use this data. And so I think once we understood that, we've had a lot more fun along the way. And you can even read a ton of the thought leadership that former company does. So it's a different form of like, as a product leader, you have to know what you have, but you also need to know what is truly valuable for that product. And if it can start to unlock future opportunities, you sometimes have to take that risk as well.
It's funny. It reminds me of early on when Chick-fil-A, which is now massively successful, the supposed potential inventor of the fried chicken sandwich, when they were starting out, it was a total fluke that brought them to selling the fried chicken sandwich, and it was not something that people were used to. Chicken came on a bone, and you ate it with a fork and knife, and it was meal. And when they came out with this in the early iteration, the person who ended up going out to found what is now Chick-fil-A would literally have to walk around the dining room and tell people how to eat it. It's, no, you pick it up with your hands, you don't take it apart, the roll apart, and you just bite it and you go, and it's a sandwich. But it's amazing to think you can have the best product, but if you are doing this massive change, part of success early on is product delivery. And that includes at times, like you said, advocating that people use it right and making sure that they're getting what they need out of it. You can have the best thing, but people aren't able to get that value out of it. Might as well sell them a rock.
That's a really good point, because it does come up. And this is where I do encourage a lot of product managers that are on the kind of more, call it digital products, right? To actually go and understand how physical product management is done, because sometimes it's a proxy in some ways. But you're right, like physical packaging is so important, and the distribution of it. And I've heard a lot of stories from companies where they create a new product and they shelve it in a different spot, maybe in the store, and then it fails because nobody thought to go over there to buy this. It's like a lot of like plant-based meats. You'll find that I think nowadays there's like a plant-based meat section. But even to this day, I was walking through my local grocery store. They have a plant-based meat section. But then over by like the breakfast sandwiches, they have their plant-based breakfast sandwiches sitting next to all the sausage and bacon ones. And I was sitting there going, I wonder how they made that decision, because if somebody's actually looking for it, wouldn't they be going to the plant-based like section versus serendipitously finding it? But maybe there's a reason for it.
Maybe it crossed the chasm enough now where it's popular enough where it's just a normal purchase decision to be made. I mean, that it parlays straight into the importance of, in building software products, UX, right? Like you can have analytics or you can have all sorts of things in your product, but if you don't build, it's why certain kind of navigation paradigms exist and why things end up looking somewhat similar at some levels is people want to know how to find the thing that they think of where, a certain thing should be in a certain place often. So if you don't call it the same thing, or you innovate too hard and don't enable people to be successful, it can often cause negativity.
I'm a huge fan of designers.
Yeah.
Cool, like product designers. And one of our biggest successes that we had as a company was probably because we had just a phenomenal designer that helped us. And I'd say one of the things that we did, it was part of this product, is we changed how people selected items in an analytics product. Typically in an analytics product, you're looking at filters, right? It's like select your filter here, select your filter here, select your filter here. And it's sort of like this wizard style where you go. And we did a ton of research and we realized, the problem with these filters is that if you're trying to answer business question A versus a completely different business question B, well, like the act of doing it is exactly the same. You're like, oh, select this option here. And pretty soon you're like, what am I doing? Like, how do I, I've lost the context. And so we looked for ways to get that context. And serendipitously, we found this great idea for, remember when Apple bought Beats? Well, Beats Audio had this really great app where you could basically fill out a Mad Lib. It was a Mad Lib, like I am feeling, some emotion while some activity, and I forget the other pieces, but you basically selected, and then it would basically give you a set of songs. And we just got so inspired by this Mad Lib format. That's how we actually structured our product. It was a business question that you were trying to answer, and you were just trying to replace the words in that business question with your options. And it turned out that was one of the most favorite features for a lot of our early customers. Were like, this is so intuitive. Like, this is the question I'm trying to answer. And I know, like, when I'm trying to replace this word, exactly what it's trying to do. So little things like that, it makes such a big difference in adoption and usage.
It seems like the kind of common thread through all this is it's not just what you build, but it's how you deliver it. It's how you bring it to market. It's how you market, right? Like you said, it's where you put it in the store. You can have the greatest CPG product in the world, but if you put it in the wrong section where they're not, early on, I'm sure if you would put plant-based meat breakfast sausage in the breakfast sausage section, it would have not worked at all. People were just not looking for that. It needed to go in the, vegetarian meat replacement section. But now the world has changed and you can do that. So, understanding not just the product you're building and the problem you're solving, but how do consumers buy that product, whether it be B2B software product where, there's a 2-year brain cycle maybe that goes into understanding the segment before you even think about buying it, versus paper towels. It still requires, like, how do people think about it? How do they understand it? How do they make these decisions? And if you do that wrong, you can have the best lab level production product that goes on to the great consumer product from a product level. If it can't be found or isn't sold the way they expect, you're going to run into friction. Well, Prabhath, there is so much more we could talk about. I have so many more questions for you. I think we will hopefully have to have you back again at some point because there's a whole world of questions I want to ask you, but I also don't want to take your whole day. It's not as fun as this has been. So we can check it off. It was another fun one. I deeply enjoyed this. I hope you did. But as a follow-up, if people do want to maybe ask them those questions that I didn't get to, where's a good place to find you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is probably the easiest to just send me a question. Happy to always talk. I love answering tough questions, and I'm just super passionate about it. So yeah, LinkedIn is easy.
Awesome. Well, Prabhath, thank you for joining us. It was a blast. I feel like I learned a lot about CPG and just in general consumer understanding. So I'm stoked. Yeah, hopefully we get to chat again, man. Thank you so much.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks.